Saving America Conference, let me start out by saying this. We are standing at a pivotal place in American history. You know, I often hear people say that they wish they would have lived during the historical times, and they're usually referring to the age of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington and the formation of America. And yet I would argue today that you and I are in fact living in some of the key pivotal times in American history. In fact, in world history. Let me rewind just quickly back to the year 2008 when America elected a man upon the mantra and the motto, "Yes, we can." I'm sure you remember Barack Obama going from sea to shining sea as he would scream this mantra and motto. It became their battle cry, if you would. Yes, we can. Unfortunately, Americans never asked Barack Obama to finish the sentence. Yes, we can what? Yes, we can allow Hollywood to dictate the morals of American society. Yes, we can allow babies to be murdered at Planned Parenthood and still stand by and stay silent. Yes, we can allow national security to be simply sold away to the highest bidder. Joe Biden, you were complicit in it too. Yes, we can. Well, I'm glad that in 2016 that America, with its resounding voice, made its own mantra when it elected Donald Trump as president. You want to know what message that sent to the world? No, we won't. We won't allow the Second Amendment to be shredded. We won't allow our constitutional principles to be thrown in a trash can. We won't allow babies to simply be murdered like they were to Bel and Molech. We won't allow these things to happen. And we elected a man that many looked at and said, well, he's imperfect. Well, I would remind you this, that you could look at every single one of the biblical characters, in fact, the historical figures throughout history, and you're going to find imperfect men that served a perfect God and a perfect cause. And I want to let you know today that Donald J. Trump was the perfect man to step into the role of president. And for the first time, we no longer have, or since at least George Washington and the founding fathers, we no longer have a politician that sits over the federal government, but we have what the designers intended in a civilian, a man of the people that sits over the federal government and is cleaning out the swamp. In fact, when I go back to the story of David, I find that when David would slay Goliath and he would kill the giant, you would see this, that all of a sudden the same people that used to cower in fear, the same ones that used to stand at the back and hide in the tree-lined shadows, the same ones that would not face Goliath because their knees were knocking and their tongue was chattering, those same ones got brave enough to chase the enemy. I'm here today to tell you that same thing is happening in America, is that for too long, conservatives were hiding and cowering in the back corner in shame and fear and trepidation. But now, because God sent a David-like figure to win the presidency in 2016, you once again find people getting their voice back. And that's the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that for too long, the silent majority was exactly that. They were silent. The thing that I learned in high school debate is that silence equals consent. Listen to me. Silence equals consent. That means this, is that if you have the ability to speak up about something, a wrongdoing, an egregious error, and you don't, that means that you are complicit in the crime. When we look back at all of the great historical figures, we notice this one thing about them all, that even in the face of adversity, they were willing to stand up they believed in. This is what made them great. This is what made them historical figures. This is what made them heroes, is that even when it wasn't popular, that they were willing to stand up in the face of a society, an evil king, a dictatorship. I don't care if it was Abraham Lincoln or Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The one thing that they had was proverbial hair on their chest to look society in the face and say, I will not be silent. You know what scares me most about the Holocaust? not only the 6 million Jews that were murdered, but it was the Christians and the German citizens that stood silent while it happened. In fact, I recently read the story, a young man that was a young German boy. Do you realize that the churches during the Holocaust, 90% of the pastors signed a peace treaty with Hitler that said this: if you don't bother me, we won't bother you. If you don't do anything to us, we won't do anything to you. Listen to me, it was a mistake. All Hitler wanted to do was silence them. And so this little German boy begins to tell this story of him sitting there in a little German church that was right next to the railroad tracks. And every single Sunday, as they would sit there in their Sunday service, they would hear the chattering of a train that was coming down the track. And every time that they would hear that train, it didn't matter if they were in the middle of tithes and offerings or in the middle of a Sunday sermon, the preacher would call for them all to rise up and they would begin to sing. And the closer the train would get, the louder that they would sing. Why? It was because they did not want to hear the screams of the Jews that were coming by in the cattle cars that were on their way to a certain death. They would rather ignore that so that they could live in the little bubble of their own reality, their own safety, their own security, while people right outside of the door were on their way to a certain death. Let me tell you this. I fear that too many conservatives, too many Christians, and too many Americans have done exactly this. We are watching the world, particularly American society, go to hell in a handbasket, and we're doing nothing about it. We have the ability to speak up. We have the ability to do something and not stay silent, and yet we cower in fear for what people think. What would happen today if the silent majority would once again begin to rise up? You're beginning to feel the earthquake coming as you see MAGA hats and packed out rallies. You're beginning to see people realize that, yes, we can have a voice, but I would call you to this attention, to this request, to this prerogative, that in 2020, we need to be louder than ever before, because this is a fight for the ages. Finally, we have a man in the presidency that is willing to stand up, and you see that the cabal that controls the world politics, you see the organizations in the swamp that's in DC, you see that they absolutely hate it because they finally have a man in the White House that they cannot control. But I would dare us to begin to bind and bond together behind our president to say it is time to save America. And the president that's in the White House is only as strong as the people that are behind him. He is a man of the people, which means this, is that he represents those of us that do not sit in that chair. He represents those of us, but what does he need? He needs a mob of men and women who too will stand behind him with a rigid backbone in the face of adversity and say, we will not bow. And if you don't think that the same spirit is alive and well in America today, I would challenge you to look at Planned Parenthood. You see, we look back through the lens of history, and we look at men and women that, whether it was Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, or whether it was Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, whether it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer standing up to Hitler over there in Germany during the Holocaust. We look at all of these different places in society, and we say, if only we could have stood with them. What about Martin Luther King and the civil rights era? I could go on and on through American history of men and women that did the right thing in the face of adversity. But let me tell you this, the same spirit that was alive during slavery and the same spirit that was alive during the Holocaust is alive and well today at Planned Parenthood. But we choose to ignore it. We choose to be silent because it's legal. Since abortion is legal, then we don't really want to step out and speak out. But I would remind you this, that in Germany, killing Jews was legal. In the slave era days, killing a black man was legal. Does legal mean it's right? No, it's immoral and unjust. And it was those voices in that hour that chose to speak up. I want to challenge some of you today that are on this broadcast to remind you that the same spirit that said that a black man was not a person, the same spirit that said that a Jew was not a person, is alive and well today that says that a baby is not a person. It's imperative and important, though, that we as Americans stand up today and say we will not bow. Because when we refuse to bow, God always shows up to do something incredible. You can look at the story of David. You can look at the story of Samson, Moses, and Elijah. You can look at the story of the 3 Hebrew boys. And when men were willing to be tortured for what was right, when they were willing to not bow in the face of adversity, God always did something. And I would remind you this. I realize that the American conservative movement and this great organization may not be a Christian organization, but I would challenge you to study the founding fathers and hear what they said about the Constitution, hear what they said about morality, hear what they said about the laws that they set down and drafted, the Bill of Rights, the freedoms that they gave us. The one thing that they all said is these freedoms do not come from a piece of paper, but they come from God. They were birthed and founded in Judeo-Christian society in Scripture. I would challenge you to realize today that the same thing that we're fighting now, the same Democrats that we're fighting now, I'll just go ahead and say it, are the same demons that they fought back then. Yet I would dare you to recognize today that there is a pandemic that is far more dangerous than the coronavirus. When I was a child, my mother had a book that we used to read. And this book had a very deep principle in it. It had a silly title, yet it speaks volumes today. And it simply says this: if you give a mouse a cookie, he'll ask for a glass of milk. What was the deep preponderance of that particular message that today rings so true? You see, when I look even through the story of Scripture, through one of my heroes, which is a man by the name of David. David was a Jewish shepherd boy that lived on the backside of a little Judean hillside, and he took care of a lot of sheep. Some would say even probably thousands of sheep that were under his particular care. But it's interesting because there are 2 instances in the Bible that show really the same parallel to American society today, and something that if we grabbed a hold of, I promise we could change America and save it once more. You see, it is that David was watching over the sheep as a little shepherd boy, and on 2 different instances, one time it was a lion and another time it was a bear. They come after a tiny little lamb, an insignificant little lamb, a lamb that is not as valuable to him as one of the grown sheep, a lamb that doesn't really produce much, but yet it is a life. It is significant to him, enough so that when a bear comes and a lion comes, he actually runs after the lion and the bear, and he slays them with his hands. He takes so much value in the lamb that he's willing to risk his life in order to save it. You see, David understood something that we need to understand today. He understood the spirit of a predator. The spirit of a predator does this. It comes for a lamb today to see if you'll fight back. It comes for something insignificant today to see if you'll put up a fight. It comes for something insignificant, and it may not come back the next day or the next day after that. But a few weeks later, when it's hungry again, it's going to remember that you were silent when it came for that little sheep. And it's going to come back again, and it's going to come back again, and it will eat all of your sheep one at a time. What am I trying to say this? I'm trying to say is that we as Americans for too long have allowed the liberal left to push us into a corner 1 inch at a time. And we've been willing to surrender all of our liberties and all of our freedoms and that which is moral, just, and right. And we've surrendered it 1 inch at a time because we've said, well, that doesn't really matter. I don't have to make a big deal about that or really fight over this. And the line has never been drawn in the sand. But I would challenge you today to draw a line in the sand in 2020 and say, we will not be pushed back any further. We will not allow our liberties to be stripped. Now notice this, a predator keeps coming back. What are you seeing happening right now in America? You are seeing the government begin to grab control. You're beginning to see tyrannical governors that are going overboard and throwing away our constitutional freedoms just to see if we'll do anything about it. But I would challenge you today as I stand here to do something, to be a voice. I don't care if it's on social media or like in Virginia or Montana or other cities where they're storming the Capitol. I don't know what it is that you're qualified to do, but whatever it is, do it. You cannot stand by silent and think that somehow that we're going to be able to save this beautiful republic that we live in, to save this democracy that has been so kind to all of our forefathers. We are not going to be able to save it with silence. No, it is time for us to speak up and to speak out and do so loudly. You know, the one thing that you learn is that if you want to boil a frog, you don't throw a frog into a hot pan of water. It will react by jumping out. The way that you boil a frog is you put a tepid water and you allow the frog to begin to acclimate to the water. And then you begin to turn up the heat one little bit at a time until finally the frog boils alive. Why? Because it acclimates to the environment that it's in. That's the problem today, is that we have allowed the Democrats and the liberal left to control the thermometer of America. We have allowed them to control the media. Do you want to know why it is that the Nazis would hand out free radios to every German citizen? You want to know why? It's because they understood that if they could control the media and the messaging, if they could control the entertainment realm, if they could control all of that and what you were listening to, that's why the Bible says that to gird up the loins of your mind, because what your mind reproduces with, that is what you become impregnated by. It's the same thing, whether spiritual or whether literal. If we allow ourselves to be propagated and infiltrated by all of this propaganda from the liberal left, if we allow our kids to simply sit in front of televisions and drink in all that which is immoral, what are we going to do? I'm telling you, they're coming for our children. They're coming for the next generation. It's funny because people called me a sensationalist when I began to prophesy this years ago. They said that I was going overboard blowing up a mountain out of a molehill. I'm here today to tell you that you're seeing the fruit of that we are literally reaping the reward of our silence today. That's why they're coming after all of our freedoms. We need to be thermostats, not thermometers. You see, a thermostat changes the environment around it, while a thermometer simply acclimates to the environment around it. Let me ask you this: when you go onto your college campus or when you go into your workplace, are you speaking up for what is right? Are you setting the tone and the mood and the atmosphere, or are you allowing the lies from the liberal left to do it? At the water cooler, when certain conversations are brought up, do you simply cower in silence, or do you stand there with conviction and speak truth? I realize I only have a few minutes left, so allow me to close with this story. It was the summer of 1863 as the Confederate Army of Robert E. Lee marched into Pennsylvania, 75,000 strong. They had 95,000 Union soldiers that were on their tail, and they would try to lure them away from some of the farmers so that they could go without having a crop that was molested by the axe of war. And yet it was them moving there to that little piece of Pennsylvania real estate on this nondescript field, a little place that we know as Gettysburg. It was not a place where they planned to fight, and yet it was one incident there that defined the battle and dictated the future of the war that would determine the fate of the nation that would be birthed from its ashes. You see, Gettysburg today, looking through the hindsight of history, we understand its importance. As General George Pickett would start an artillery bombardment against the other side. And I don't have time to go through all of the historical context, but there was a battle, there was a charge, there was a stand, and there was a retreat. From Cemetery Ridge to Seminary Ridge, this entire ordeal took only one short hour, an hour of hand-to-hand combat. And yet it was the turning point in a battle that became the turning point in a war, that became the turning point in a nation. It's said that the Civil War is the hinge of history for this great nation. Well, if the Civil War is the hinge of history for this nation, then Gettysburg was the hinge of history for this battle. And that it was Pickett's charge that was the hinge of history for this entire war. Literally everything that happened in America came down to this 1 hour of hand-to-hand combat. The entire 200-year history that we today celebrate came down to simply 60 minutes of fighting. It was a dramatic point in American history. But why do I say all of that? Well, if I could paint a scene in the backdrop for you to understand how important these moments were, that now historians would call them some of the most sacred moments of American history. It was amazing to historians when they went back and they began to read the diaries of those men that fought in that war. You want to know what surprised them? Was the fact that the battle, the war seemed ordinary. There was nothing about Pickett's charge to them that seemed of significance or importance, and yet the hinge of history, of American civilization and society, well, it hinged on that exact moment. You see, I realize that you're probably looking here at a newfound organization, the beautiful American conservative movement that's been started here by these wonderful men. And you're saying, well, it's just another organization. You're maybe even looking at this conference and saying, well, it's just another conference. You're looking at this election and saying, well, it's just another election. But I would challenge you today that we are standing at that same hinge of history. We have begun to taste what the Democrats and the liberal left want to do to the American society, to the American Constitution, to the American Bill of Rights. And while this is not yet a war of bullets and bayonets, it is a war of words. My question to you today is this: are you going to be a voice, or will you simply be an echo? Will you echo the sentiments of popular society and your favorite Instagram influencer and a TV star and some no good celebrity that spouts off their political ideology with no to little research? Will you be an echo of the mainstream media and culture and fake news, or will you stand in the midst of all of that, and will you be a voice? And should we one day have to fight for our freedoms the same way that our founding fathers did, my only question is this: will you die for your freedoms? It's a heavy question, but I know this, is that I'm willing to die for my freedoms. I just don't know if the people on the other side are willing to die to take them away. If there's ever been a moment that we need to be consecrated to the cause, our prayer is that America would never come to a civil war, that we would no longer see the absolute travesty that we saw a couple hundred years ago. But I will tell you this: in order for us to never get there, it means us taking a stand now while it's a war of words. It means us speaking up. It means us not being full of fear. It means us being willing to go to war and battle ideas. I often tell my kids this: for those of you that are familiar with me, you know that I'm constantly living under one death threat or another. We have people, in fact, just recently that walked up to myself and my family in public and begin to drop four-letter words and flip us off to our faces and say disgusting things in front of my children. You see, we live in a society where the other side is controlled by demonic principles and demonic spirits. My question is, are you full of truth? Are you full of conviction? And are you willing, in the face and in the midst of all of this, to be silent no more? To be a thermostat and not a thermometer? Are you willing to engage culture before culture engages you? I want to challenge you today to support this movement, the wonderful men that I know. I'm friends with a few of them that have formed this organization. I challenge you to support them financially, or whether you support them through prayer, or whether you support them by joining their email list and being a part of the cause. If ever there was a day and an hour that we need more men and women to speak up, it's now. And I challenge you to get behind Jeff and Ken Peters and some of these other men. And I challenge you to fight with them, to fight behind them, to fight beside them. Because in the end, we're fighting for our lives and for the lives of our future generations. God bless you guys. Thank you so much for having me on this live stream. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ken, and all of you wonderful, wonderful people.